The police had one suspect, and they were convinced they had the right man. But when the DNA results came back, the truth came crashing down. And with it, a question that would haunt the investigation for years. How many innocent people are sitting in prison right now because of a flawed system? It all started on a humid summer night in 2018 when James Cooper, a 35-year-old mechanic with a quiet life in a small town, was dragged from his home without explanation, arrested for a crime he knew he didn't commit. This was just the beginning of a story that would expose corruption, mistakes, and the danger of jumping to conclusions, and it all began with a man wrongly accused. But no one could have predicted the shocking twist that would change everything. It was a Wednesday night when the break-in occurred. The victim, Sarah Dunham, a single mother of two, returned home to find her apartment door smashed, the room ransacked, and valuables missing. A feeling of dread sank into her stomach as she realized the intruder had been in her home while her children slept in the next room. The police were called, and the scene was quickly processed. The burglar had been quick and efficient, taking only what he needed: a laptop, cash, and a set of old jewelry before vanishing without a trace. But what the intruder didn't know was that Sarah's home security system had caught everything on camera. The footage was grainy, but it was enough. The police could see a man entering the apartment, wearing a hooded sweatshirt and gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints. But there was one thing the cameras couldn't catch: the face. The man had kept his head down. The next morning, Officer Darren Hayes, a seasoned officer known for his hard-nosed approach to crime, was on the case. He saw the grainy footage, the vague description of the suspect, a man with medium build, wearing dark clothing, and he made up his mind. James Cooper was the man they needed. It didn't matter that James had no criminal record, no connection to Sarah, and no real evidence linking him to the crime. But he matched the description. He lived in the same neighborhood as Sarah. And that was enough for Officer Hayes. James was arrested in front of his house, his hands shoved into cuffs as his neighbors looked on in shock. He couldn't believe it. He had been dragged out of bed with no explanation, no clear reason. "You've got the wrong guy," James pleaded, but no one was listening. His desperate cries fell on deaf ears. The case seemed open and shut. The evidence was circumstantial, but it seemed to fit. James had been near the scene, he matched the suspect's description, and his neighbors said they'd seen him walking late that night. But something didn't add up. Sarah's testimony, while powerful, was full of inconsistencies. She had been shaken, no doubt, but the suspect's description didn't align with James's physical appearance. There were details that didn't match, but no one seemed to care. Still, James maintained his innocence, holding on to the hope that the truth would come out. He was placed in a holding cell while the investigation continued. Weeks passed, and the pressure mounted. The police department was desperate for a breakthrough, and the media began to report on the local mechanic who was arrested for a burglary in his own neighborhood. It wasn't long before everyone assumed he was guilty. But then, something happened that no one expected. James's lawyer, Alicia Lee, suggested a DNA test, the one thing that could either confirm his guilt or free him. The police reluctantly agreed. It wasn't a major part of the case yet, but they had nothing to lose. What came back, however, shattered their entire case. The DNA collected from the crime scene didn't match James's. It didn't even match any of the officers' or other suspects' profiles. It was someone else entirely. James was cleared. He was innocent. The DNA test was the game changer, but it didn't end the nightmare for James. The damage was done. His name had been dragged through the mud. His reputation was ruined. He had spent weeks in jail, and now he had to rebuild his life from the ground up. The real burglar, whose DNA had been discovered at the crime scene, was still at large. The police turned their attention to him, but something gnawed at James. He had been wrongly accused, and he couldn't stop thinking about how easy it had been for the system to get it wrong. Months after the DNA test exonerated James, Detective Alicia Lee came across something strange in the case files. One of the officers involved in the investigation, Officer Darren Hayes, had a suspicious connection to the crime scene. There were links between Hayes and a local crime syndicate, one that had been operating in the area for years, involving everything from petty theft to drug smuggling. But the most chilling discovery was that Hayes had been aware of a larger criminal network and had helped cover it up. The break-in at Sarah's apartment was only the beginning of a much larger operation. Alicia Lee immediately contacted the authorities, but as soon as they began to investigate further, Hayes disappeared. He was gone just like that. James's case wasn't just about a wrongful arrest, it was about something darker, something that had been hidden behind a badge for far too long. The truth about Officer Darren Hayes had yet to fully unravel, and the real criminal network was still out there, operating with impunity. The DNA test had exposed one truth, but it had also opened the door to a much larger conspiracy. And with Hayes on the run, the question loomed: who else in the department was complicit in this web of corruption? And how far would they go to keep it hidden? James Cooper was free, but his nightmare was far from over. After the DNA test cleared his name and proved he wasn't the man responsible for the break-in, his life should have returned to normal. Instead, it had only just begun to unravel. Officer Darren Hayes, the man who had been so certain of James's guilt, had disappeared, leaving behind a trail of questions that no one seemed to want to answer. What had been a simple mistake now looked like something darker, something more dangerous. The truth about the corrupt forces at work within the department wasn't just waiting to be uncovered, it was actively hiding in the shadows. And as James began to piece together the evidence, he realized the stakes were higher than ever. In the weeks after the DNA test, James tried to return to his normal life. He found a new job, tried to re-establish his relationships, but the damage to his reputation remained. He couldn't shake the thought of what had happened: the wrongful arrest, the incompetence, and the endless weeks spent behind bars. But his biggest concern now was Officer Darren Hayes. Despite being exonerated, James couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. Hayes hadn't just made a mistake, he had been too sure of James's guilt from the start. And when his disappearance became public, it raised more questions than answers. James started looking into Hayes's background, speaking to old colleagues, and checking public records. What he uncovered was deeply unsettling. Hayes had been involved in other questionable cases, some of them eerily similar to his own. And then there was the crime syndicate. There were whispers that Hayes had ties to a local underworld organization, one that had been responsible for intimidating witnesses, covering up crimes, and manipulating investigations. The more James learned, the clearer it became: Officer Hayes wasn't just a bad cop. James wasn't the only one who was concerned. Detective Alicia Lee, the lawyer who had helped him, was now looking into Hayes's past as well. She discovered that not only had Hayes been a key figure in a series of corrupt investigations, but he had also been involved in suppressing evidence in cases where the wrong people were arrested. It wasn't just about one mistake, it was a pattern of abuse. As Alicia dug deeper, she discovered that Hayes's disappearance wasn't as random as it seemed. In fact, it looked like someone had warned him. He had erased all his personal data, disappeared from the city, and his last known location was a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town, a place that didn't even show up on his official records. But what was he hiding? What did he know that was worth running for? Alicia and James were determined to find out. They decided to visit the apartment complex, hoping to uncover any leads that might explain Hayes's sudden departure. But when they arrived, they found it was locked up tight, with no sign of anyone living there. The landlord, a nervous man, told them that Hayes had moved out months ago, but he couldn't say where. Frustrated, Alicia and James decided to try a different angle. They would dig into the unreleased police files about the crime syndicate that had been operating in the area for years. Hayes was not the only officer who had been involved. As they looked into the murky world of organized crime, they realized that high-ranking officials within the police department had been working with the syndicate to protect the criminals. It was beginning to look like the whole police department had been compromised. While searching through the files, James came across something shocking: a set of encrypted documents in Hayes's personal file. These documents, which had been hidden under layers of bureaucracy, detailed covert operations involving drug trafficking, money laundering, and smuggling rings. There was one name that kept coming up: Officer Darren Hayes. James and Alicia couldn't believe what they were seeing. These documents showed that Hayes had been working as a liaison for the criminal syndicate, using his position to feed information to drug dealers and criminal organizations. He had been paid handsomely for his role in protecting them from law enforcement. But the most chilling part of the files wasn't just the corruption, It was the names of several high-ranking officers, including Captain Michael Hayes, Darren's uncle, who had been implicated in covering up the criminal activity. It was a network of corruption that went all the way to the top. James and Alicia knew they were walking on dangerous ground. They had uncovered something bigger than they had ever expected. But there was one last piece of the puzzle that had to be put together: the identity of the people funding the syndicate. Alicia's suspicions led her to a startling discovery. The syndicate's backers were not just local criminals, they were connected to a powerful political family in the region. Senator Robert Chase, a man known for his anti-crime stance, had been secretly using the syndicate to fund his political campaigns. His connections to organized crime went deeper than anyone could have imagined. Alicia and James knew this was their breakthrough, but it also meant they were no longer just fighting corrupt officers. They were up against a well-connected criminal network with ties to high political office. As Alicia and James prepared to take their findings to the press, they were suddenly interrupted by a phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar Officer Darren Hayes. "I know what you found." Hayes's voice was calm but cold. "And if you think exposing this is going to bring justice, you're wrong. I've been hiding behind this badge for years, but there are people far more dangerous than you realize. You have no idea who you're messing with." Then the line went dead. The chilling message was clear. Hayes wasn't just running from the law. He was warning them that they were now targets. But who was he protecting? And how far was he willing to go to keep the truth buried? James and Alicia had uncovered something massive, but the question remained: was anyone truly safe from the shadowy forces pulling the strings behind the scenes? What lengths will Darren Hayes go to protect his powerful allies? And what happens when those who seek justice become the prey? The investigation had already unearthed a criminal conspiracy involving Officer Darren Hayes, a network of corrupt officers, and an organized crime syndicate that had been thriving for years. But the truth they had uncovered wasn't just about a corrupt cop. It was about a system so deeply entrenched, it had made even the most powerful political figures its protectors. As the noose tightened around Hayes and the truth began to surface, a chilling new reality unfolded. Someone powerful wanted to keep this hidden at all costs. And now, those who were closest to the truth had become the prime targets. James and Alicia had just uncovered the last piece of the puzzle. Senator Robert Chase, a rising political star, had been funding the criminal syndicate for years. His involvement in the dirty dealings was more than just a quiet partnership. It was the backbone of the network. Without him, the operations would collapse. But James wasn't just dealing with corrupt cops anymore. He was up against a political machine that could control everything, from the media to the legal system. With a dirty senator protecting them, they knew the fight had just become life-threatening. Before they could act on their discovery, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was unmistakable: Darren Hayes. "I told you you were in over your head," Hayes sneered. "You're out of your depth, Cooper. You've made a fatal mistake coming after me. You have no idea who you're up against. This isn't just about me anymore. This goes way higher. People will die because of this." The line went dead. Fear wasn't just gnawing at James's mind anymore. It was consuming him. He could feel it in his bones, that something bad was going to happen. This wasn't just an investigation. It was a battle with forces too powerful to face head-on. Alicia was equally concerned. They had crossed a line now. What began as a case of wrongful arrest had spiraled into a political conspiracy with the potential to shake the foundations of everything they knew. As they raced against time to compile the evidence, they received an anonymous tip that changed everything. The message was brief, but the implications were devastating. "Senator Chase's people know everything. They've been watching you. The walls are closing in. Get out now." It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. James's and Alicia's lives were now in immediate danger. With the news of their discovery, James and Alicia went into hiding. The FBI had gathered evidence from the police files, but they were still fighting to get higher authorities to take them seriously. Meanwhile, the criminal network was acting fast to cover their tracks. Senator Chase was too powerful. Hayes was still at large, and now it was clear he had become a pawn in a much bigger game. But their investigation hadn't been without consequences. Days after the phone call, Alicia's office was ransacked, files were shredded, computers were stolen, and all evidence of the case was wiped clean. It was a warning. Keep digging and they would disappear, just like the others. As they reached out to trusted allies in the FBI, Alicia received an encrypted message. It was a secure link from an anonymous source inside the police department. The file she opened was inconclusive at first until she noticed a set of coordinates attached to the message. The coordinates led them to an underground facility that had never been reported, one that seemed to hold answers to a much darker secret than they had anticipated. James and Alicia knew they had no choice but to go. The truth wasn't just hiding in the shadows, it was locked in a black market system of political corruption and illegal operations, and it was only a matter of time before the people who had helped them disappeared too. That night, under the cover of darkness, they drove to the location. The underground facility was hidden beneath an old, dilapidated building that had long been abandoned. They sneaked inside, their hearts racing with each creak of the floorboards. As they made their way deeper into the facility, the air grew colder. The smell of rusted metal and dust filled their lungs. They reached a room at the end of a long hallway and stood frozen in shock. Documents. Hundreds of them. These weren't just ordinary documents. They were contracts, illegal deals, bribery records, proof of every person who had been part of the corruption network. There were names James and Alicia had never heard of, people who were untouchable. Senator Chase, police chiefs, judges, all connected to the syndicate's operations. But the most chilling part? The documents included plans for future crimes. One of the upcoming operations involved targeting whistleblowers, people like Alicia and James, whose knowledge was too dangerous to let slip. Just as Alicia reached for the stack of documents, the sound of a door opening behind them echoed through the empty hall. "Get away from the files. Now." The voice was cold and calm, but it sent a shiver down James's spine. Standing at the door was Officer Darren Hayes, alive, well, and holding a gun. He didn't come alone. Behind him, there were more men, some in suits, others in tactical gear. Hayes was no longer just a rogue cop. He had become a leader in a much larger operation. "James Cooper, Alicia Lee, you've dug too deep," Hayes said, stepping closer, his eyes narrowed in cold fury. "Now you'll pay for it." Before either could react, the lights suddenly went out. The whole room was engulfed in darkness. The tension in the air was electric, and James felt his pulse quicken. He couldn't see what was happening, but he knew this wasn't just about to get dangerous, it was about to get deadly. Would they survive long enough to expose the truth? And would the conspiracy remain hidden, or was this the moment it all came crashing down? What happens when the people who are supposed to protect you become the very ones who seek to silence you? And how far would they go to keep their secrets buried? The room was suffocating, the air thick with tension. James Cooper and Alicia Lee stood at the mercy of Officer Darren Hayes, who had led them into an underground operation of crime, corruption, and lies. The lights went out, plunging them into darkness. The echo of Hayes's voice was cold and distant. "You've dug too deep, Cooper. Now you're both going to pay the price." With his gun pointed at them, James and Alicia knew they were seconds away from their lives taking a deadly turn. But just as quickly, everything went silent. In the pitch-black room, James's breathing became shallow. He could hear Alicia whispering something to herself, probably calculating their escape, trying to think of a way out. But the reality was that their situation was dire. Hayes stepped closer. James could hear the clink of his boots on the floor. The tension was unbearable, like a thread about to snap. "You're trying to expose something much bigger than you can handle," Hayes said. "You don't know who you're up against." But then, a faint sound in the distance, the whirring of machinery, the muffled sound of doors opening. Someone was coming. Hayes turned sharply, the sound of the gun scraping against his holster breaking the silence. James and Alicia's hearts raced. In that brief moment of confusion, Alicia sprang into action. She grabbed a nearby object, a steel pipe, and swung it blindly in the direction of Hayes. The pipe made contact, and Hayes staggered back, a grunt escaping his lips. James, adrenaline rushing, jumped forward, knocking the gun from Hayes's hand. The weapon clattered to the floor. "What the hell's going on here?" a voice called from the shadows. It was another man, Officer Daniels, a detective who had worked on James's case. He wasn't alone. Behind him, a group of agents entered the dark room, weapons raised. James and Alicia were momentarily saved, but it wasn't over yet. Daniels's face showed confusion as he took in the scene. "What's happening here, Hayes?" Hayes glared at Daniels, his eyes narrowing. "You have no idea what you're stepping into. You're on the wrong side now, Daniels." In the aftermath of the confrontation, James and Alicia were taken to a secure location. It was clear that the criminal network they had uncovered wasn't just about corrupt officers. It involved political figures who had been silencing dissenters and controlling criminal activity for years. Daniels, now a reluctant ally, began to reveal the truth. He explained that the operation they had stumbled upon was far-reaching, with connections to high-ranking officials, both in the police force and the government. The syndicate was protected for a reason, Daniels said. Senator Chase wasn't just funding criminals, he was protecting his own interests. This goes back decades. Blackmail, bribery, you name it. The police force has been compromised, and now, so has the entire legal system. James and Alicia learned that Officer Hayes had been involved in more than just protecting criminals. He had been working directly with Senator Chase to use his position to influence elections, shut down investigations, and even stage fake arrests to clear the paths for criminals to act with impunity. But as Daniels spoke, James realized there was something even more sinister going on. Hayes was now a liability, and he was willing to take down everyone who threatened his safety. Alicia knew their next move was crucial. "We need to go public with this. We have to expose Chase, Hayes, everyone." Daniels hesitated. "I don't think you realize what you're asking. There are people out there who will stop at nothing to protect their secrets." "I'm not asking," Alicia replied, her voice hard with resolve. "I'm telling you, we have enough now to bring everything to light. If we don't do this, we're no better than the people we're trying to fight." But just as they made their plans, an urgent phone call cut through their conversation. It was a mysterious source, someone from within Senator Chase's inner circle. The message was simple: "They know what you found. You're not safe anymore." Just as they were preparing to move forward with their plan to go public, the building they were hiding in suddenly exploded. The blast knocked them to the floor, the force sending them crashing into the walls. The sound of debris crashing down filled the air, but when the dust settled, it was clear. Someone had found them. A black SUV screeched to a halt outside. Men in black tactical gear poured out, weapons drawn. They were coming for James and Alicia, and they were closing in fast. Alicia, her heart pounding in her chest, grabbed James's arm. "Run. Now." They sprinted toward the back exit, adrenaline pushing them faster, the sounds of gunshots ringing in the distance. They were being hunted. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about survival. As they reached the alleyway, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Officer Hayes, his face twisted in a sneer. He was holding a silenced pistol and pointing it directly at James. "You're too late," Hayes said, his voice cold. "This is bigger than you can understand. No one walks away from this." Then, before James or Alicia could react, Hayes pulled the trigger. James Cooper had come too far to turn back now. After weeks of being wrongfully accused, exposed to the darkest corners of police corruption, and barely escaping with his life, he finally stood at the edge of truth. But it wasn't just about his name being cleared. It was about bringing justice to a broken system that had failed him and so many others. But nothing in this case had been easy. Nothing had been predictable. And with the threats still looming over them, James and Alicia Lee knew that their fight wasn't just against Officer Darren Hayes or Senator Robert Chase. It was against a powerful, corrupt network that was desperate to protect its secrets. And this time, they couldn't afford to lose. The bullet missed. The moment Hayes fired, time seemed to slow. The silence was deafening, but James's instinct kicked in. He grabbed Alicia and pulled her down behind the nearest dumpster as the bullet ricocheted off the alley wall. His heart pounded in his chest, but he was alive. The world outside seemed to fade into nothingness as they ran for cover. The alleyway was narrow and dimly lit, and the sound of footsteps behind them grew louder with each passing second. Hayes wasn't alone. More men, dressed in black tactical gear, closed in from both ends. They weren't just looking to stop them, they were looking to make sure they never spoke again. But in the distance, James could hear the faint hum of sirens, growing louder by the second. Backup was coming, but would they make it in time? In that moment of desperation, Alicia reached into her bag and pulled out the evidence they'd been hiding for weeks. The final set of documents, the encrypted files, everything they had uncovered about the crime syndicate, Senator Chase's involvement, and Officer Hayes's deep ties to the criminal underworld. She had a choice to make. They could hide, run, and hope that someone found the truth. Or they could take a risk, fight, and expose it all no matter the cost. "I'm doing it," Alicia said, her voice trembling but determined. "We're going to end this." James nodded. They couldn't run anymore. The world needed to know the truth. With shaking hands, Alicia sent the files to the press, the FBI, and every relevant authority they could reach. In seconds, the world would know. The truth was finally in motion. The sound of sirens grew louder, but Hayes and his team were closing in fast. They had nowhere to go. There was only one way to end this. James turned to Alicia. "Get ready." In the distance, headlights flashed as FBI agents arrived on the scene, guns drawn. But before they could act, Hayes raised his gun again, aiming at James. The air felt thick, a moment of life or death. But then, something unexpected happened. A single gunshot rang out from the other direction. Hayes fell. And standing there, in the distance, was none other than Detective Daniels, his gun still smoking. "I couldn't let you finish what you started, Hayes," Daniels said coldly. "The corruption ends now." With Hayes neutralized, the FBI agents swarmed in and quickly arrested the remaining members of the syndicate. Senator Chase, whose entire political career had been funded by the dirty money flowing from this network, was taken into custody, and his empire began to crumble. The evidence Alicia and James had risked everything for was finally in the hands of the authorities. But the most profound moment came when Detective Daniels, now working with the FBI to take down the rest of the operation, pulled James aside. "There's more to this story," Daniels said quietly. "Your name, James, was just the beginning. The truth about everything, the corruption, the cover-ups, the lives lost, is all coming to light now. And it's because you and Alicia didn't stop." James felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was also mixed with sadness. He had fought for justice in a system that had almost broken him. But now, at last, the truth was shining through the cracks, and the people responsible were going to pay. The months that followed were a blur for James Cooper. The news spread like wildfire, the DNA test that had exonerated him, the fall of Officer Hayes, the arrest of Senator Chase, and the exposure of a criminal network that had operated in plain sight for decades. James didn't just return to his old life. He became something more, a symbol of perseverance, of the fight for truth, even when it seemed impossible. Alicia, too, became a hero in the eyes of the public, known for her dedication to justice. Together, they gave a voice to the wrongfully accused and exposed the dark side of a broken system. But perhaps the most beautiful part of the story was James's quiet realization. He was free. Not just in the eyes of the law, but in his soul. He had been tested, pushed to the edge, but had emerged on the other side stronger, knowing that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to rise. James Cooper and Alicia Lee had fought against the shadows of a corrupt system and won. The justice they had sought was not just for them, but for every voice that had been silenced. They had exposed the lies and, in doing so, had shown the world that sometimes even the darkest corners of society can be illuminated with the light of truth. What happens when the truth finally rises to the surface? And how many more hidden stories are waiting to be uncovered? Subscribe for more Dark Justice Files episodes.